Want to be the first to welcome you back to the Athlete Ready Global Podcast. I'm your host, Jared Saavedra. It has been a while since we have uploaded a podcast episode, and I'm here to tell you I am refocused, refreshed, re-energized to bring you some of the best content and value that I possibly can. Gonna have some amazing performance coaches, speed coaches, personal trainers, and some interesting fitness enthusiasts on the podcast to help you along your performance and fitness and coaching journey. So I'm excited to do that. Had to take a little break. I had to step back just a little bit. I was focused on too many things at once where I had to kind of compartmentalize a little bit and kind of downsize, if you will, my focus. And now, really, it's interesting. We talk about programming for our athletes and our clients kind of on a yearly plan based on, vacations, based on school, based on whatever it is that they're going through. And sometimes as performance coaches, we don't practice what we preach in that kind of way. And if you know me, you've probably had these conversations before about, hey, what does it look like during, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four? There's going to be different focuses in each one. When I was coaching, I was just focused on that. And I knew when my downtime of the seasons were, where I could focus on more networking, more continuing education, those types of things. But here to tell you, I am looking forward to bringing you some more value and content. If you have not subscribed to this podcast, please do. Give us a review, whether you like the content, you don't like the content. I'd rather get feedback and be able to help improve this and give you as much value as possible. All right, so on to this episode. I think you guys are gonna really like it. All right, in this episode, it is episode 18. We got Coach Mark DiSalvo. Coach Mark, he is a performance coach and entrepreneur out there in New York City. You already know, every single time I go to New York, I have to meet up with this guy, go check out his gym, and just kind of be around the guy. He's always good energy. He's always positive. I've never even seen him upset, and he's just a good dude. When it comes to training jiu-jitsu athletes, as far as their general physical preparation, he has so much knowledge, and he also practices what he preaches. He actually is a BJJ practitioner himself, so he is able to understand the movements, the energy system demands, all of those things while preparing his athletes for competition. If there is one person that if you were looking for, jiu-jitsu strength conditioning, this is someone that you have to ask questions to. He's definitely one. I'll make sure I link his contact information in the description of the podcast. So if you have any further questions after that, be sure to hit him up. All right, and let's go. Man,
how's it going?
Good. How you doing, man?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah. Excellent.
How are you doing, man?
Good. Thanks for your patience. I had to squeeze some lunch in real quick before.
No problem. I know how it is.
For the back half of the day. Yeah.
I know how it is. Man, that hair is beautiful, man.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've been a supporter ever since you started that journey, man.
I appreciate that. I should have listened to you sooner. It was really a COVID thing. It was like, well, it was kind of hard to get your hair cut, and then it grew out, and it was like, oh, this looks all right. And
I was like, this guy's going to be an icon in the industry with that.
I have to give a shout out to my good friend Erica Fleischman, who owns Fleischman salons in New York City here. So they take care of it. So
there you go. If you
want the main, you go to her. So.
Shout out. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, let's jump right into it, man. Sure. I got a lot of questions for you.
Yeah. Please, let's jump in. I said, it's all genetics. Some guys are born to bench 500, and some people just have hair. So
yeah, there you go. I'm jealous, man. Mine's changing a little bit over the seasons.
Oh, no, it's always good. But anyway,
All right, man. So let's, I want to talk about jiu-jitsu today. That's going to be kind of our main topic. I want to
Sure.
know kind of your story behind how you really started where, to get to where you're at today, especially working with all the jiu-jitsu athletes that you work with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, you said you want to know how I got started, or?
Yeah, man. Tell me how you got started.
Well, I mean, it got started because I was involved in jiu-jitsu myself, and I really was enamored with the sport, as most people are when they get into it. And you start training, a little more seriously than your intro classes. This is like a little over 8 years ago, maybe. Yeah, about 8 years ago or so. And anyway, but at the time, like combat sports in general, I would argue, not just jujitsu, was in a weird place when it came to strength and conditioning. Like there were some really there were some really great coaches who were involved with it, but it was like you could count them barely on one hand. Like one was Lauren Landau. He was working with all those guys in Colorado. And there were a lot of guys like me. And like, I think honestly, he was like the biggest one I can think of. And then really it was a lot of younger guys like me who now are doing really well for themselves and have a great crop of fighters and grapplers. But jiu-jitsu, especially, separating from MMA, is very different than wrestling. It's very different than MMA. It has overlaps and similarities between wrestling, but it's different enough that like you can't just treat it like wrestling for preparation purposes. And nobody was at that time was paying attention to jiu-jitsu strength and conditioning. Maybe the only one who could say it and say it in earnest was one of my old mentors, Steve Maxwell, because he was like one of the first dozen American black belts, and he himself owned a gym and was a strength coach and was obsessed with, jiu-jitsu and preparing guys for it. Like he had, he was Royce Gracie's trainer for the first few UFCs. He was like Salo Ibero's trainer back for those ADCCs. So,
man.
So that's like kind of where it started, was just like, oh, wow, nobody's doing this. And I want answers. Like, I'm very curious, it wasn't like I'm looking for a niche. It was, I really liked, I loved jujitsu. And I wanted to figure it out more, because so much of the rhetoric at the time was, no, nobody, you don't need to train, just train jujitsu and this kind of stuff. And I knew that there's nothing unique about jujitsu, that like, you wouldn't say that about football. You wouldn't say that about baseball. So I knew there was nothing unique about jujitsu in that respect.
So you've been coaching for how long?
This was, I believe, the 10-year mark this year.
Okay. Congrats on that. That's great. So you've been coaching for 10 years. You've been training jiu-jitsu for 8 years. What was it like that moment you decided like, hey, I'm going to try this thing? Like what brought you to do that? Because that takes a lot. I mean, you'll hear black belts all the time tell you, hey, like the hardest belt to get is a white one. Just like starting the journey. What was that like for you? That process of just, hey, I'm going to try this out and kind of see where I can go do with it.
Starting coaching specifically, or jiu-jitsu?
Jiu-jitsu.
Well, for jiu-jitsu, I've been a lifelong fan of combat sports, and I loved boxing growing up, and I loved everything from as a kid, from professional wrestling all the way up to boxing, and and then getting into MMA like more in my late teen years. And I got a little bit into Muay Thai around that time, but I started realizing around the time I was like 18 and 19 that, it's fun to hit pads and stuff, but like hitting other people and getting hit was not, call me a wimp, whatever, but it wasn't going to be in my everyday, in other words. And honestly, I grew up playing hockey and I loved hockey. I think I just like violent sports, honestly. But I grew up playing hockey and I had a lot of concussions. So I was very mindful as an 18-year-old, kind of before a lot of the concussion stuff, that, that's not a good way to exist. Like you don't want that. So, anytime I would get rocked in the head, doing anything like outside of hockey, I was like, that's not good. So, but it doesn't mean I didn't not want to participate in it. So it just kind of took me some time to sort of find jiu-jitsu and get to the point where I really wanted to do it. But there was always the desire to get involved again with some martial art or some combat sport. But for me, it was really difficult because, you're in college and, you don't have a lot of money. And then you get out of college and you're trying to get into something like coaching, like like what we do. And, you just don't have the funds to do that kind of stuff. And honestly, like in a weird way, it's like you don't have the time, especially at first. So, but then then paradoxically, you suddenly have lots of time when you're a new coach. So yeah. So as soon as I was making enough money where I was like, hey, I can spare a little bit, I went right over to Marcelo Garcia's, and that was how it all started. So it was like, it was in the making for a while. Yeah.
Okay. And then you taking on your first BJJ client. Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
I'm trying to remember who the first one would have been. One of my earliest memories was of a guy on the mat. So it all just came from being on the mats, being there day in, day out, and you get to know people and people know what you do. Especially in today's world, like you have no excuse because, everyone has social media and everyone's looking at social media. Mm-hmm. So, if you even document a fragment of your day and you're friends with these people, they're going to see it and they're going to know what you do. And then they'll ask you things. So there was a guy at our gym who I believe had just gotten his brown belt. And, he wasn't a pro competitor, but he was a very serious guy, like a very serious trainee guy, like competed a lot, trained all the time, was having like severe back pain, was very, like when I started talking to him, I realized like lifestyle habits, everything was just so out of whack. Wasn't sleeping, was on crazy amounts of caffeine to just get through the day. And he's training twice a day and he's working in New York City and has a full-time job. And and his body was a wreck and he was like a ticking time bomb. And he was the first that I spent a lot of time with. So I saw the extreme of like, this is somebody who is in a really bad spot injury wise, like because as a result of training and not taking care of themselves, mm-hmm. which is a lot more people than you'd think. So that was my first exposure to like that side of the arena. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the guys I started working with more often were guys who, we would just talk in the locker room or before or after class. These were more guys my own age. So I got at that time, it was like, 25, 26. And, you're kind of like, you feel invincible. So you don't mind trying kind of anything mm-hmm. out. So they would tell me things they were doing and be like, what do you think? And I'd be like, that like sounds cool. I'm going to try that. And then, we would just mm-hmm. exchange ideas. And, it wasn't very rooted in anything. Like for me, I'm trying to give them good advice, but they're telling me like, hey, I'm going to do this crazy shit, whatever it was. And after I started talking to them enough, I got this idea sometime around 2018 or 2017. And I said, why don't you guys come in on Saturday mornings? Cause I'm never seeing anybody on Saturday mornings. And it was like the four of them. And I was like, just, we'll pull together money. Like, I'm not going to charge you a lot. Like it was very, very little. And I said, come in every Saturday morning. And we started doing that like every Saturday morning. And I wrote a program for them. And then for the guys who were really serious, I was like, this is what you should do during the week. And they'd take a picture of it on their phone or write it down. And, we're usually talking about like, they would have all the gear when they came to my spot, but when they were on their own, half of them had a gym, half of them just had some kettlebells. So it was like, we had adapt a little bit. Yeah. But this is kind of a long story, but yeah, this is how I kind of started. This was like my like kind of two-way in, mm-hmm. But the time between the guy who was super wrecked and that training group was probably like almost 2 years. Like it was like, I couldn't get anyone to really be interested at first.
Well, that brings me to kind of my next question about that, because coaches, especially young coaches, I get asked all the time, like, how do I position myself to be perceived as an expert in something that I don't have a lot of experience myself in. So for you, for example, you just started your jiu-jitsu journey. How do you position yourself as a strength conditioning coach to these people who are really good at jiu-jitsu? Do they look at you differently? Like, hey, this guy is young in the sport. How is he going to be able to help me? Like, how do you answer those questions, or how do you position yourself to be the go-to guy?
It's one of those things like you can't pretend like you are an expert when you're only like 2 years into it, because like if you're really good at lying to people, then you're being kind of, that's like very disingenuous, and it's going to come back to bite you. And but if you're, it's like the two ends of the spectrum. Like you don't want to lie to people, and oversell, but you don't want to undersell yourself. So, it's really, there's an old phrase that one of my old mentors, Charles Poliquin, always used to say, that relationships are built at the speed of trust. And that's like one of my core like business values that, I always come back to all the time, is I never force anything. And it's like when you're in training, you have to realize you're having relationships with people. Like these are not, it's not purely transactional. So it's, you're going to have to take that time, like go and invest in your time, basically, like be at the gym, like talk about things other than training, like it's about showing them that you care. And if they know that you care and that you do this thing and you're making a living off of it, like then you do look like enough of an expert, because like this is literally how you pay your bills, and you care about X person, and it just compounds and it goes from. So you just can't force things. It's hard to tell yourself that while it's going on, but I was lucky that I had the people in my life that I did, from like a support structure, to sort of remind me of these things. So I didn't get too bent out of shape during it. So that's why I think, having, good family and friends or mentors or these things are helpful, is they can remind you and make sure you're not acting out, and, you don't turn it on yourself, basically.
Okay. And now that you have like this experience, the plethora of experience that you do, that during that like initial intake of a new client, what are some of the things that, again, with the knowledge that you do have now, what are some of the things that you ask, and what kind of assessments do you do initially to get kind of a good like landscape of this person's body, their history, all that stuff?
Yeah. It's the same assessment I use for all athletes and clients, honestly. There are, on the one end of the spectrum, special strengths that make up a great jiu-jitsu athlete, like attributes that you want to really emphasize. But for most people, they just need to be more complete, healthy humans first. And a lot of people who are in jiu-jitsu are not there to be like top level competitors. And so you have to make sure that they're doing that first. And by saying doing that first, I mean like being healthy humans that can move and have basic strength and decent cardio, and they have adequate mobility. Like if it's a triangle, the base of the triangle of like a class population, that's like the base of the triangle. And then you work your way up of competitors and how seriously these people take it. And then you have the top of the food chain people. Typically the top of the food chain people are obviously, they've taken care of those health habits and those, and they're adequately strong, good athletes. But, occasionally they haven't, like, they're just so good at jiu-jitsu. They're so good at the sport. But most people, it's just figuring out where their weaknesses are and shoring those up, and making sure that making sure that if they're already strong, that we take the time to make sure that, they're not in pain. If they're in pain, making sure we work through that and then get them strong. If their endurance is really poor, we work on that. It's just kind of making sure that they're like a complete athlete all around.
Okay. So, well, speaking of like fitness qualities, how would you define the difference between like fitness and actual conditioning?
It's probably semantics depending on who you ask, but like when I hear those words, I think conditioning, to me, I put more in the realm of like energy systems and how you respond to, being under stress, high heart rates, cardio, in other words. And fitness, I look at as a sort of general blanket term, as it includes cardio, it includes sort of general strength, GPP, like these kinds of things. Yeah.
Okay.
But, I guess if you're listening to this, like as somebody who's newer, younger, kind of trying to figure these things out, it's, have a system and sort of stick to it. Cause sometimes it just gets semantics like laden, and there's not a lot of difference between what a lot of good coaches do. It's just, there's like little nuances, but like 90% of what they do is like all the same, you know?
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
What would you say, maybe some mistakes that you've seen online, maybe from other coaches, maybe athletes, just kind of in general that you may see on social media, which social media doesn't really give the whole entire picture, but what are some
Yeah.
things that you've seen online that's like, that you see as mistakes, and like, what are some solutions to them?
Well, it's always tough because you never know the context of what you're seeing. Like on Instagram, like when I see somebody, like, that's why I don't spend a lot of time thinking that way about things. Like, I'll say this to answer your question, because, you know, there's so many situations where I'm like, yeah, you know, that could be a good idea to do for somebody, but man, I think I see like one person every other year who that would be good for, and they're sharing it on Instagram, and it's like, all right, maybe that's exactly what that guy needed. And, you know, and he's going to go rock his next few matches and, you know, be a world champ. I don't know. That'd be awesome. But I think neglecting sort of the basics, what we were talking about, like looking at people's, like being able to assess well people's posture, for instance, especially in jiu-jitsu, because it's a sport, that's like all based on like, how bad can I break down your posture to make you submit? So it's like, if you have really, really, really terrible postural muscles anywhere, lower back, upper back, shoulders, you know, that's generally where it's going to be, or your neck. Like you need to be working on that, and you probably can't do enough work on that. And, you know, because you'll never see a top guy, especially with ADCC coming up, you'll never see an ADCC guy with a small neck and who like walks like this. Maybe like one guy, and he's like the freak, you know what I mean? But like, and he's just so good at jiu-jitsu. But most of them are going to have crazy good posture. They're going to have like really strong upper backs. So the mistake, if there was one, I just don't see enough. Like, you're going to see on my Instagram, they're going to see guys doing like the same 5 exercises, like 3 out of every 5 things I post. Cause it's just like, that's what we're hammering home. Like, cause that's what jiu-jitsu terrorizes. And it's like what you need the most, you know? So never be afraid to just be strong, and just constantly be strong, you know? It doesn't mean you neglect other things. It doesn't mean that some of the cool, weird looking stuff, that like these really crazy power movements, doesn't mean that they're not good. It just means that, you know, there's a time and place for them. And usually the nuttier the exercise is, the time and place is probably that much less. Like that's what I'm getting at.
What would you say the average camp, I guess, or do most of your athletes, do they work with you year round?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's the hardest part about jiu-jitsu, as you probably know from MMA as well, that they're constantly taking fights or having tournaments. There is no off season. I always try to if I can get, the optimal way for me to work with someone is understanding that we're going to be together in the long term. And we look at the next 6 months to a year, and I want to know what 1 or 2 tournaments are most important to them, or what 1 or 2 matches are most important to you. And when they tell me that, then we can peak you around those times. So you might compete at any point in between there, but I'm not changing the plan unless, like, you know, or they're not changing the plan unless like something really calls for it. You know, We're trying to get you, if it's for Worlds, like, and there's a lead up of tournaments, like obviously, like I'll taper maybe prematurely a little bit the week of a few of those tournaments, and maybe not like do anything too crazy that week, but the eyes on the prize of Worlds, like, or like in my case now with the one guy I'm working with, he's going to ADCC. So like that's in September, and like, that's the prize. Like, he's going to be doing super fights and stuff in between, I'm sure, but like, they're not, you know, we're looking at ADCC as the time. Like right now it's very general prep for a harder camp ahead. So it's not like, we're not whooping his ass or anything right now. We're not, you know, we're working hard, but we're trying to build the baseline, which, you know, he's a professional. He's already got that in droves.
Yeah, absolutely. So if any young coaches are listening to this, when you say like general prep, like, would you take us through like a session design, just a typical example of a session design during this type of phase?
Yeah. So, you know, like what I always tell people is like, wherever you want to take somebody, like if you have an end goal in mind when you're programming, and like right before ADCC, I want to make sure he's lifting around this much for this many reps. I want to see this speed on like the VBT monitor. I want to see like, this weight, this body comp, whatever. Then you have to work back at like, well, what does it take to get someone there? You can't just like peak them like in 4 weeks to do it. I mean, maybe you can if their base is awesome, but you always have to work back. Like if you want to lift, this is what I tell a lot of the guys I work with who power lift and they're lifting big weight, is like, if you want to lift big weight, you're probably gonna have to take 8 weeks before that to get in the condition just to lift big weight. So you're gonna have to start with the longer sets and the bigger volume and then slowly cut it down and watch the intensity go up. And then we can start rattling off doubles, and triples, and maybe singles by week, 12 or whatever it is. So it's my, so I look at things in a very macro view first, because you have to understand like where your North Star is. And if you understand that, then you can always make adjustments, don't be afraid to make adjustments, The higher level the athlete, you're going to need to make more adjustments, and your program will never look like it does, like written out. You could be very anal retentive, and that's actually a good quality in my mind. I wish I was more that way and write out like 12 weeks of exact workouts day to day. But you have to know that that's going to change. Like there's going to be things that pop up and
absolutely
have things. So I don't know if that answered, or if you want.
Yeah, no, it did. That did for sure. Yeah. For young coaches as well, like if I guess how would you teach a young coach who may have never experienced an adrenaline dump themselves, or, they're working with athletes that are very, very new or kind of beginning their jiu-jitsu journey that really haven't dealt with those types of stress? Like, what would you teach them from your experience in order to like really help them prepare for those moments?
I think that's one thing that makes combat sports unique, is that I think you have to sort of experience it yourself on some level to really get it. Like,
I agree.
Really good coaches will understand and be able to adapt it. Like, and you never will set foot in the cage or the mats, and that's fine. But it's really hard unless you've experienced it. It's like, it's very different. And like sparring 2 rounds with gloves only is so different than 8 minutes jiu-jitsu, is so different than, 4 minutes sparring with kicks and everything, and MMA, cage wrestling, everything. It's all so different, and it takes it out of you in different ways. So like, I like that question a lot, because years ago, a friend of mine also said to me, like, I had a good friend, Froylan Sanchez. He's a great trainer in LA. Like if you're a runner or like track athlete, track and field, like he's your guy. And we would always say like, like sometimes you really have to train hard to know what training hard is, because, those, especially when you're dealing with like a combat sport, or like you have people with very extreme goals, like you kind of have to know that. And it can be really hard. Like we felt like outsiders. I remember I had like just started jiu-jitsu and everything felt hard. So I couldn't really say if I was training hard or not. And,
when was your first adrenaline dump?
Definitely when I played hockey, like when you're a teenager and they start having you run these drills and you have to do them in like 60 seconds or less, like basically like suicides, the hockey equivalent of suicides, that kind of thing. That was probably it. I definitely have had many adrenaline dumps in jiu-jitsu. Probably,
man, it's the worst.
Yeah, my first competition, I definitely did. My first competition, and I had it in the bullpen beforehand because I was like too warmed up. So that was a problem before that match.
That was a mistake on mine. So like with my professor, and it was someone that I was training as well, he had told me, hey, just show up, whatever weight you are, just show up at it. Like you don't need to cut, you don't need to do any of that. It's your first tournament, and I got to the competition when I was supposed to get there, and it ended up being like 3 hours behind. So like you said about I was too warmed up. I was in a division where I weighed in at 191.5, and this division was from 190 to 215. So it was a huge discrepancy in weight there. And so like I was in my first match and I was just super amped. I was like excited. And And man, like once we got to tussling a little bit, hit the mats, and dude, I was just zapped. Like this was like 20 seconds in. I had nothing else to give in 20 seconds, and we hadn't even really done anything. All we had was each other's grips, and I was done. And I was like, man, that's real.
Yeah, it happens to a lot of people. I think if you're going to be a competitor, you're going to go through it once. Like, so you may as well just like try to compete as much as you can when you're younger and early on, because just get it out of the way, because it's going to happen.
It is going to happen. It is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that also important to think about too as it relates to, experiencing and knowing like kind of like how hard to push people. Just remember, it's like less is almost always more. So if you're really unsure and you have no interest in jiu-jitsu, and you end up training jiu-jitsu people, which I kind of think probably most people aren't that way. Like if you're going to be training jiu-jitsu guys, you're probably into jiu-jitsu yourself. Just remember, a lot of these guys train so much. Jiu-jitsu is strength training on its own. Like I'm going to botch this, but you'll get the impression, or like the important bits. But there was a study done on Olympic athletes in all Olympic sports to see if they were to take, it was either a biopsy of the muscle, or it was either they were trying to look at the blood lactate and like those hydrogen ion levels to see like how much like was actually built up in the blood. And the two sports that had the highest readings were swimming and judo. So it's like that ability to sort of, so what you can surmise from that is that, in a sport, especially gi jiu-jitsu, it's like you're gripping and pulling, holding, and all this isometric tension. And then these quick movements, like you're creating a lot of muscle damage. You're creating a lot of, like waste product that your liver has to deal with. So every jiu-jitsu class is like this, depending on how intense it was, it's like a strength training session of its own. So like, in reality, for a lot of people, like training probably needs to start more gentle and then work its way up and then pull itself back down, like any good program. So
absolutely,
usually start with less.
Absolutely. All right, before I let you go, man, we're gonna play a quick little game. It's gonna be how you respond. All right, so it's gonna just be kind of your initial response to some of these things that you may commonly hear from an athlete and a coach. All right.
Okay.
All right. So the first one would be if a jiu-jitsu athlete responded to you in your coaching or during your assessment that, oh, I didn't really think strength matters as much in combat sports or jiu-jitsu. What would your response be to that?
I would tell them, why are there weight classes then?
Thank you. Great response. That's a great response. And they don't really think about those things at all. Because it's always like, oh yeah, strength doesn't matter until it matters, until you meet someone with equal skill as you. And then all of a sudden, and they're a lot stronger than you and they're just as skillful. That's not going to be a good one.
Definitely. And if you're that much stronger than somebody, even when they're decent, like you can probably really mess them up. Like maybe not a black belt, but like, that was another thing that Steve Maxwell had always taught me too, is like, as good as you think your jiu-jitsu is, even if you feel like you have good, like street jiu-jitsu and like good self-defense, like you don't want to get hit by one of those big bouncer dudes. So you should probably avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great one. And my last one is if a coach or a professor told you, hey, Mark, I want you to train my athlete, but I want to make sure that it's BJJ specific. How would you respond to that? Has to be BJJ specific. My first question would be, what do you mean by that? Because it goes back to what I said before. Like, all athletes are athletes. So you need to treat them as the human first, Yeah. I'll be the judge of how specific they need to train, Absolutely. No, that's spot on. Well, man, thank you so much for your time, bro. I will not keep you any longer. I enjoyed it.
Please. I'm happy to do it as long as you need, man.
Yeah, man. No, we're good for today, but appreciate it, dude. I gotta go to New York and visit you sometime.
Definitely, man. Now it's about to, the weather's getting really nice. So it's a perfect time of year to come.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you like your new spot where you're at?
I'm actually moving.
You just moved. Oh, so you haven't moved yet?
Next month. Yeah.
Oh,
but
okay.
my gym's in the same spot. At least for now. We'll probably be moving in the next few years here, but maybe sooner. But the gym's been great. Yeah. Brooklyn's great. Manhattan, everything's been good. Yeah.
Hopefully within the next 3 or 4 months, I'll be able to get out there and visit you.
That sounds great, man. No, I look forward to it.
All right, man. Thanks for your time, dude. I appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. It's always good to talk to you.
Absolutely.